Okay, well, we're picking back up where we let off before I was gone last Sunday. If you want to go and open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 11 and get settled in there. So as we get started, let's kind of remind ourselves of what this entire book's about and looking at the idea of really cultures. I mean, when you think about the different types of people you have in congregations, and especially when it comes to this new church, the new church that's bringing in a very deep-rooted Hebrew people and the Mosaic law, and it was very exclusive. It excluded everyone that was not Gentile. You could become a part of the nation by being a proselyte or converted, but you were still looked at as a Gentile. But the promises and everything for, if you think about it, for, going back to the covenant relationship, we're looking at around 1000 BC. So we're talking, close to, 10, 11 generations, centuries of this type of thinking and teaching, especially once Mosaic comes along around 1200 BC, and we find the finalized written form, uniform code of the law, the ceremonial, the religious, and all those things. And that culture from 1200 BC till when Christ comes has just been their mindset. And then in that, we've been looking at all along, even in Sunday mornings over the past 2 months, looking at the Hebrew writer talking about this idea that, Christ is a fulfillment of it. It's not a separation. It's not an abrupt break, fracture, discarding of the old and bringing in the new. We're just all brand new things. No, that it's a completion of it, that it was shown. And it's not something that abruptly just popped up. It wasn't a second thought that God said, oh man, my people aren't going to accept me, so I've got to come up with something else. Which, don't laugh too hard, because that's actually how some people teach. Is it somehow that because of the rejection by the Jews, that the kingdom didn't come, and that now we are in a church dispensation. And anyway, I don't want to go far off. That really bothers me, because it really defeats the prophets. The prophets really indicated the idea that there was a kingdom coming. So now when we come back and look at the Romans, and you have these people that started a church in Rome that were primarily Jewish culture, citizens in Rome, but they had migrated or moved there after the dispersion. We don't know. There were Jews in synagogues all around the Mediterranean region. After the captivity of Babylon, they returned. Some of them stayed there. Some returned back and built up the temple and such after the return of captivity. Some stayed in these different locations. Day of Pentecost comes. We see where they're all from all over the world. And Christ, the word comes in. Christianity starts. The kingdom is built. And then they disperse. They go back. So now you have a church that's primarily built by who? It's built by Jews that have become Christians. And then they convert. And so all the people there in Rome, well, guess what? They're not Jewish of tradition or custom, so they're being integrated. And so now we talked about how that the emperor had thrown them out, threw out all of the Jews, whether they're Christian Jew, he didn't care. And in that throwing them out, left behind in Rome just those Christians who were Gentile originally. And then Nero comes along and he goes, hey, you guys come on back. So all the Christians that were Jewish, that were thrown out, come back. So apparently there's some sort of a disruption there. But it's great. A lot of times the problems that other people have is a beautiful thing, because we can learn from theirs. We can look at the fracturing of cultures and getting along and relationships by looking at some that are broke. And this is one where you can see this. And on top of that, what's really great about this is this explains really the total plan that God has had from the beginning of our fall to the completion, and how God was fulfilling it and coming through. But there's this idea of self-righteousness and justifying ourselves before God that is always a challenge. Always a challenge. I mean, how do you get right with God? And so to the Hebrew, it was to be right with the Mosaic law. To the Gentile, well, he had to come and now obey. And so there's this mixed match. But then all of them, honestly, were failing to accomplish it. A Gentile, well, they had gone off on their own deranged moral living, and God gave them up. But then the Jew, he had the law in which he should have been able to teach and show and display it. He failed to keep it. And he'd become a hypocrite, because the very thing in which he was saying not to do, he was doing himself. So, okay, that's not working. So how else? Well, if you're the Jew and you're sitting there going, for 12 centuries, I've had my family following after God, and that's the way he told us. Okay, maybe we weren't perfect, but to tell me now that I can't be righteous with God because even though I was a Jew and a descendant of Abraham, I got a problem with that. Because then what was it for? And that's a good question. I mean, what is it for? And so Paul deals with that in this letter. But he's also trying to really bring out the main point in the first half of the book. How are you going to be right with God? And he brings up Abraham, great historical guy that the Hebrews could look at and go, yes, he's like the George Washington. We respect him, but then there's a dilemma, because then Paul brings up the point. He goes, oh, wait a minute, how was Abraham found righteous with God? Before circumcision or after? And the Jew has to go, oh, well, it was before. And then you have to ask even a little further, what law was he under? How was Abraham found righteous according to Mosaic law? No, we're still hundreds of years, 400 or 500 years before Mosaic law comes in. So how was he found righteous? And Paul simply says, faith. Faith. Nothing that Abraham could do of his own. And that's what he's trying to show. There is no way any of us ever, ever, ever can do anything worthy. Even if it is good, even if it's wonderful. When you come to the God level, we can't do it. It doesn't mean don't do it. That's the other problem. Don't then say, well, I just give up then. I'm not going to be good. I'm not going to do good things because, well, it doesn't matter anyway. No, because if you have faith, that comes by knowledge. Knowledge tells you how to then act and you follow through. But the point is, it cannot be done of yourself. So give up on that. That means you can't do it, you can't do it, you can't do it, I can't do it. None of us can do it. So where do we turn? We turn to him. That equalizes it. Nothing you have in your culture, mine, can do it. Whether you're Gentile or not. Still doesn't solve the problem if you got these pagans who doesn't seem to deserve it. For beginning of Cain's murder of Abel, what did they do to ever deserve getting any attention from God, to get any blessings from God? I mean, come on. Look at all the ugly things they did, all the child sacrifices, all the different things you could go through and look at. I mean, they caused the earth to be destroyed by a flood because of their ungodliness. That's those dirty Gentiles and those pagans and stuff. So, okay, maybe I as a Jew, I'm not that great, but I got to be better than those guys. I got a better pedigree. I got a better heritage than what they have. And that's what he's trying to say. Stop that thinking. It can't be done that way. And once you can release that and understand that there's no way you can save yourself, and you come to the idea of salvation is only through faith, and that's how you're justified. But then in 10, he does bring up the fact, faith comes by hearing God's word. And it's not just some meditation. It's not just some voice in your head. It's knowledge. Faith comes from hearing the word of God. And so he comes and builds that. But now, in 9, 10, and 11, if I was to give a quiz, I hope you get this right, because I keep pounding this in. We're now changing from that idea of righteousness and establishing it to now understanding how this puts together in a plan. How does it, now lay this out for me, Paul. So chapter 9, he dealt with the past relationship and how the fulfillment of that plan, and he does bring up the fact of the beauty of the Israel as a nation and everybody and how it's brought through. But he also clarifies, and he says, now it's not every person who is a descendant of Abraham who gets the blessing. And you go, wait a minute. That's what I was always taught as a Hebrew. I get the blessings, right? Yeah, you get some of the blessings, but not the blessing. It's one descendant that was going to come through. That's what God was working. So understand that, because once you can understand that, you'll start to loosen up a little and understand the idea of what does Israel mean. In the word itself, Israel, think about it. Where did that name even originate? It originated in a wrestling match between God and Jacob. And you think about the name alone, it's wrestling with God. Hasn't man always fought with God? You know, I mean, we're the ones who won't date. Jacob was a scoundrel. That guy, you know, I mean, if you look at a lot about his life, and he will not relent in this fight with the angel of the Lord. And finally, he has to submit him by hurting him. And it's like, and then he wants a blessing. Give me a blessing. And the blessing was really a descendant, a blessing upon his generations. We think of a blessing in a different way today, but he's talking about give me this blessing upon my family, my descendants. And so he says, you will be Israel from now on. He asked him, what's your name? And he says, no, now it's Israel. So now the play on words becomes this idea that who is Israel? And that's what we have to understand. Now, prior to Christ's coming, Israel was a nation. It was descendants of Abraham. But their God, through the prophets, have always brought this idea up. But not all of them were truly the saved. Let's clarify it and be more specific. Because the other word we use may lose a little bit in translation in the sense of when we say a remnant. The true Israel in God's mind is what he calls the remnant. Just because you have the heritage does not mean God sees you as one that's got the blessing coming from Abraham to Jacob in this blessing. So it becomes a term used for the remnant. And then he transitions that word to showing those who are faithful, who have faith, justified by faith, are of Israel. It's not based upon law, circumcision, or anything else. So my question is, then, who is Israel today? The faithful. That's the concept he connects that keeps going all the way. Is that he says, and that's what he's showing in Romans here, is that remnant of Israel, and that's what he starts out. We already looked at the first part of 11 there, is the remnant of Israel. And it's not because God was rejecting, he has been faithful, but even in that faithfulness to the whole promise, there's still very few who have come through and remained faithful with him. So then in 10, he looks at the present conditions that was going on. Now we're looking at 11 and looking at the future. And how does that apply as it plays out? He started out by talking about, has God rejected his people? He says, no, by no means at all. He has not rejected his people at all. That's something that's hard for us to understand. If you were Hebrew, you'd feel very rejected because nothing's normal. New normal is not the same as a Hebrew was. But he uses the example that he himself, being a Jew, he hasn't been rejected. So he says, I'm a great illustration of that. So not all that are Jewish have rejected God and rejected the gospel. And so they're a part of this remnant, and he's always saved them. He uses the illustration of Elijah and how Elijah felt in that when he battled the priest of Baal, how he felt that there was nobody left that was righteous. He goes off into the cave, and then God says, hey, you need to get out. There's still 7,000 that have not submitted. There's still people out there. So I think that's a good illustration as well when we think about an application of, we don't know who they are. We can feel very pitiful. We can look at things and we don't know who they are. But the point is God does. God knows that there's still a remnant. And we can't judge necessarily who all they are, but very clearly that's one of the things that he is trying to show is this remnant. And so he has not rejected them. And he uses that illustration. I'm just kind of scanning through some of these verses from the last time about Elijah. And so he says in that same application of the way it was that historically, that's what's going on today. There's still this remnant that's still there. But it's different. This is by grace. So what's grace? He's saying by God's favor, not you, not by works. And he goes through that kind of logical loop or kind of that little thing with saying grace can't be works and works is grace. And basically saying that it's God's favor only. It goes back to faith. It's not by the law again. And so he asks the next question in verse 7. He says, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it diligently seeking, but the elect obtained it. So what happened? And yes, he does. And he uses 8 through 10 to describe this condition that basically was reflective of an historical event during the wanderings. When they were coming out of the land and they were fixing to go in, when Moses gives his speech and talks to them, he basically is speaking in a way that's so amazing, but he's telling them and giving them a speech about this idea that you have wandered through the wilderness, I've given you all this stuff, you witnessed all the blessings, but yet you still hardened your heart. And in that condition, it's produced this in you to where really you're not going to listen, you're not going to hear. There will always be some that it will be a stumbling block to them. And that's another word that we know, that Christ not only was a cornerstone, but also was a stumbling block as well. So now we come to this amazing idea of how do they all come into one? And that's when we get to verse 11, and he starts out this idea about the integration of the two together. And I label it kind of the grafting in of the Gentiles. So when you're grafting in, what are you grafting into? What's the primary? So he's talking about integrating what the root was, and the root is Israel, and it's the promises and everything around Abraham. And so what he's saying, he's going to show, is how God has taken the Gentiles and brought them and made them a part of it, grafted them together. So he asked the question. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, though through their trespasses, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion be? So that's a unique point. So coming back, remember that, full inclusion. They're not on the outside. They're not getting just part of the blessing or anything. They are fully integrated with it. So did their stumbling, was it on purpose? No. Did God want them to fall? No. No, it wasn't meant that. And there's a difference in the way that he phrases this, stumble versus that. Did they fall? No. They stumbled, and some of them did fall, but not all of them, and it wasn't designed for that. What you have kind of, and it may be very oversimplistic, is the way that children interact with each other, like teenagers and stuff, and one parent will sit there and show and demonstrate to one child what blessings he can do and what good things he can do for the child, and the one that's rebellious will look at the other one, and what does he do? He sees the rewards that the one that is compliant and getting, and the other one becomes jealous, and it may cause him to stumble and do something dumb and maybe yell at his brother or get upset, but the point wasn't to make him fall and make him worse. It was to cause him to look at the blessings that the other child is receiving and want them, and not just to lose that child. No parent wants the other one, but he blesses one and gives the one good things that is compliant and obedient, faithful, and the other child may sit there and look, I got the same father as you. Maybe even a better illustration would be an adopted child to a child that was born in the family, and the adopted child starts getting all the blessings and the good things the parents given to them, and the blood child is sitting there going, well, why is he? I'm your blood. And it should, instead of causing him to fall, it should cause him to look at him, the other child, and go, my brother, I need to be like him if I want to receive the same. So if it causes him to stumble, if it causes that, but you know what it does? It demonstrates something greater. It demonstrates the greater picture. And if it brings them in and saves them all, that's the bigger reward of what he's saying in the full inclusion. And this is what he refers back. I don't want to jump on that too much, but in Romans 10, 19, and 20, when he quotes from Moses about, and this is where they should have seen this coming. These are the little passages that, man, why did you not see that the Gentiles, all those foreign people, were going to be a part of the total nation that God was bringing forward? We read some of them this morning very clearly. It talks about how that God was going to bring in all these different races of people, all these different nations were going to come in and enjoy that great blessing. And Paul's bringing this up in Romans 10, 19, and 20, where he says again, he quotes directly from Moses. Now, what did they hear, though? I don't know that they got it. I don't know that it was necessarily, but it was something to where they could reference back to when they're reading it, when Paul then brings it up, and they go, he did say that. That's right. I guess that fits. I will make you jealous by those who are not a nation. With a senseless nation, which they looked at the Gentiles that way, I will provoke you to anger. And Isaiah, even bolder, said, enough to say, I was found by those who did not seek me. I became well known to those who did not ask for me. Now that's in Romans 10. He's quoting both Moses and Isaiah to try to look at that idea. And the Gentiles were those who get this great benefit, but yet they weren't really looking for it. They didn't earn it. And he says that's exactly it. And that should demonstrate to all people that it doesn't mean anything about your background, where you come from. What it means about is your faith. Whether you're a Gentile, pagan, Roman, Greek, no. And that's what I think is really the beauty of that. God can be found by those people that initially were not even looking, but they were able to find him because they were seeking. So now he turns to the Gentiles in 13. And he says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means reconciliation of the world, see that? Everybody, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered at first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are all the branches. There's not a defiled branch hanging on this tree of Israel. Every part of it. So he says, that I minister to the Gentiles. And, if he does and he makes them jealous, and that's what it did, just think about all the times in the conflict he got in the synagogue when he traveled around. I mean, they would lose their minds. And some of them it triggered, and they responded, and they would be saved. And that's what he's kind of showing, is that, you know what, I took this blessing to the Gentiles, and I knew it was going to strike a nerve. It's going to strike a nerve on you. And I hope it'll get your attention and wake up. When you see the power of God performing these wonderful miracles among the Gentiles and blessing them, it should wake you up to say, now wait a minute, I need to reconsider my prejudice about what I think is righteous before God and what God's plan was, and provoke them into this, I think, self-evaluation. But if that means a rejection brings a reconciliation of all of man, then that's even better. That's it. And he used that idea of the dough. If it first was holy, then the whole part's holy. So that's really looking, and he's going to dig more into that, drawing this illustration of the branch and the olive tree, really. So there's not any part of that dough that is unholy. You pull a part of the original dough, that is holy. Any part of the branch, whether it's a part natural or as God has grafted it in, it is holy. Doesn't that sounds very similar to what he started out this whole book about, was Jew or Gentile, you're both unrighteous. There's only one way you can be found righteous, and that's through faith. Faith like Abraham, and not works of your own. So he starts in this idea of the root. Everybody's attached to the root. What's the root? See, that's where kind of like, what are you talking about? I mean, the root is really the idea of the Mosaic law, the promises, everything that God has established, the gospel, all of it together is where we need to attach to. The root is where substance is drawn forth from the earth and feeds and nourishes. If the root is damaged, everything dies. The root supplies the exact same nutrients throughout all the plant. It doesn't hold off to one plant, one branch or the other, and they're all treated as equal. But the root is God. The root is Christ. And so everything that's a branch on that is something that is righteous. So now we have two types of branches. We have a Hebrew branch, genealogically and custom-wise, and then we have a Gentile branch that are being brought in to nourish off the same root. So he goes on 17 through 20. But if some of the branches were broken off, by the way, that's the unfaithful, the rejecting Jews, and you, remember, who's he talking to? He's talking to Gentiles. He said, now to you Gentiles. And you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of what? Their unbelief. So let's pause a little, kind of broke 20 up a little bit there. But so this is a great illustration. The source is God, the blessings of God. But then he reminds them, you have been brought into this, but everything is not the way you're thinking. You do not support the base. The base is supporting you. God supports you. And the other branches that you are now a part of and joined in and been grafted in, don't look at them as if they're less than. He's talking to the Gentiles. He's very specific about them. Some of them have been broken off, and that's what happened. Not only were they broken off, but when you look in Rome, some of them were thrown out of town. They were run out. And now they're back. And God, part of the message here, Paul is trying to get them to reconcile. So that's something that's a part of all of this layering here. So they're broken off. Why? Because God said, nah, I don't want them? No, it was faith. The opposite of unbelief is faith. How are we found righteous? Faith. How did they get broken off? Lack of faith, unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note, then, the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you. Provided, here's conditional, you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their belief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own tree? I think this is, even as confusing as it may sound, I think it really does profile the conflict that's going on in the church in Rome between those who were Jewish descendants to those who were pagan. And now the church trying to deal with a lot of these ideas. But it's a great teaching tool to look at the relationship of who's right, who is righteous before God. None of us, no one, no matter how good you preach, lead a prayer, teach a Bible class, go visit the sick, those are great things, and they're needful. But that's not what's going to make you right before God. It's going to come back to your faith. And just because them as the Gentiles, there were some that were broken off because they didn't have faith and discarded, and they've been grafted in. And by the way, another thing is, they didn't have to be broke off to get them in, okay? There was enough a tree here that they could have all been on one tree. You know, I don't know why. Maybe it's just me. I had this image that somehow they had to be broke off to make room for the Gentile branches to be put into this new tree. No, he's just saying that some were broke off, and don't get all puffy because now you're a part of it, and you're like, haha, you were natural, and look what happened to you. And now I'm a part of it. And he said, now wait a minute. If he could take something that was unnatural and bring it into this non-wild olive tree, don't you think you could take that was natural and bring it back? That to me also shows God's love and patience and redemption, and the idea that it's not predestined. God is showing a picture here that there is a possibility that they could come back, and some did. We know, as we read in the first years of the history of the church, that there were some of the Pharisees and priests that end up accepting Christ and becoming. At first they rejected him to the point where they were standing out there chanting, yeah, crucify him. Even after the day of Pentecost, many of them were still persecuting the church. But we find, and those would be the branches that were broke off. But we know that some of them also, it is recorded, became Christians. That would be that grafting back in. So it's dynamic. And it all comes back where he says here, don't be proud, but fear. Understand, your salvation is not a deadlock just because of something that's already happened. It's a constant evaluation of realizing that you have to remain faithful. But again, faith is knowledge. Knowledge is something that you're going to obey, you're going to follow, you're going to be guided by as well. So if he had the power to graft you in, he can definitely bring them back and graft them in. All right, that was fast. That's like Speed Bible 101. And I know it's a lot. I hope that you will read that again. It does seem that way. Try another translation like the NIV or something. Go back and forth between some. I think that's very helpful to understand his logic here. But it really is a great section. And it gets even better when he gets down and he's going to start talking about the mystery of Israel's salvation, because that's what it seems like. It seems like this is so mysterious when it's really not. He's been pretty clear about it. If you're with us this evening and there's something that we can do to help you with your relationship with God, becoming a Christian or prayers or anything else, if you're online and there's something you have a question, we hope that you would submit it to where we could respond to it. I get them all and I do respond to them, whether it's in the future or not. If there's something we can do to help you, if you're not a Christian, become a Christian. We'd love to have an opportunity to study with you. So think about these things. We're going to be singing an invitation song, and let us know while we're singing, or reach out, send us a message.